Welcome, friends, and settle in, but perhaps steady yourself a little tonight, because the road we are about to walk is a darker one than usual. We tend to think of the grave as the one place where a person is finally safe, finally beyond all reach, laid down at last in peace that nothing on earth can trouble. Tonight we visit the graves where that peace was shattered. For the 15 souls we will stand beside in this first part of our journey, and the 15 more who wait beyond, death was not the end of the story. Their bodies were stolen and held for ransom. Their skulls were carried off in the dead of night. Their bones were scattered across oceans, hidden inside walls, cut apart for souvenirs, dug up to settle arguments, or sealed at last behind steel and concrete and iron bars to keep the robbers out. These are the most disturbing things that ever happened to the graves of the famous, and we will tell each story plainly and completely, standing at each resting place, or at the empty spot where a resting place should be. Let me be honest with you before we begin, as I always am. Some of what we will hear tonight is genuinely grim, and some of it is so strange it edges toward the darkly comic, the kind of macabre farce that seems too outlandish to be true and yet is written plainly in the record. I will not dwell on the gruesome for its own sake, and where a detail is uncertain, disputed, or wrapped in legend, I will say so, because these stories are unsettling enough without embroidery. What binds them together is a single hard truth, that fame does not end at the grave, and that the same celebrity which drew crowds in life can draw grave robbers, souvenir hunters, fanatics, and thieves long after death, so that the most famous among us are sometimes denied the one thing every human being is promised, the right to rest undisturbed. We will see bodies that traveled farther in death than most people travel in life. We will see families forced to entomb their loved ones in concrete and steel, not for grandeur, but for protection. We will see graves that stand empty, and monuments that guard no one, and tombs that hold more than they should. 30 stories wait for us across the whole of this walk, and tonight we begin with the first 15, moving gently from one to the next, pausing at each just long enough to feel the chill of what was done there. You may find, as we walk, that a strange pattern repeats itself. Again and again, the disturbance of a grave was answered by an almost desperate act of fortification, families and caretakers responding to theft and desecration by burying their dead deeper, sealing them in concrete, caging them in steel, hiding them away, as though the only way to grant the famous their rest was to make their graves into fortresses. There is something profoundly sad in that, the idea that celebrity can rob a person even of the simple anonymity of the tomb, that the price of being loved or hated by the world is to be pursued into the ground. And there is something to be learned in it too, about how the living treat the dead, about reverence and greed and obsession, about the thin line between the pilgrim who comes to honor and the vandal who comes to take. Keep that in mind as we go, and watch how often peace, in these stories, has to be built like a wall. So take my arm, and lower your voice, and let us begin with one of the most famous body snatchings in all of history, a crime so absurd and so cruel that it might have come from one of the victim's own films. Let us begin in the little Swiss village of Coursier-sur-Vevey, on a green hillside above Lake Geneva, at the quiet cemetery where Charlie Chaplin was laid to rest. The little tramp, the most beloved comedian the world has ever known, the genius of the silent screen who had been hounded out of America during the Red Scare, died peacefully at his home nearby on Christmas Day of 1977, at the age of 88. His widow Una and their children buried him in the village churchyard, and for a little over 2 months he lay in peace. Then, on the 2nd of March, 1978, the police called the Chaplin home with almost unbelievable news. Someone had dug up the grave in the night, and Charlie was gone. So began one of the most spectacularly clumsy body snatchings in history. The thieves soon telephoned with their demands, wanting the equivalent of some $600,000 for the safe return of the comedian's body. And when Una refused, saying flatly that Charlie would have found the whole thing ridiculous, they made chilling threats against her 2 youngest children. But these were no criminal masterminds. They were 2 struggling auto mechanics, refugees from Eastern Europe, hoping to fund a garage. Police tapped the family's phone and staked out 200 phone kiosks across the region, and after 5 weeks they caught the pair, who led them to the body, buried in a cornfield about a mile from the Chaplin home. Charlie was returned to his grave, but this time the family took no chances, sealing the plot beneath a thick layer of concrete so that no one could ever disturb him again. The men behind the theft were almost pitifully far from criminal genius. The ringleader was a young Polish refugee named Roman Wardis, who had read about a similar Italian case in a newspaper and convinced himself that a stolen celebrity corpse could solve his money troubles and fund a garage business. His accomplice was a Bulgarian mechanic named Gencho Ganev. Their scheme collapsed under the weight of its own clumsiness, and when they were caught, Wardis was sentenced to 4.5 years of hard labor, while Ganev, judged the lesser partner, received only a suspended sentence, both convicted of grave robbing and of disturbing the peace of the dead. In the weeks the body was missing, wild rumors had swirled through the press, one even claiming the corpse had been moved because a Jewish man should not lie in a Gentile cemetery, a grim absurdity that only deepened the family's distress. Through it all, Lady Una had held firm, refusing to reward the thieves with a single franc, and when at last the ordeal ended and Charlie was carried back to the little churchyard, a spokesman said simply that the family was relieved it was over. There was something bitterly Chaplinesque in the whole affair. A tragedy and a farce tangled together exactly as in his films, the beloved tramp reduced to a bargaining chip by two bumbling fools. And so his family made certain it could never happen again, pouring a solid slab of concrete over the reopened grave. He rests here now, secured against the world. Let us travel now across the Atlantic to Springfield, Illinois, to the great tomb at Oak Ridge Cemetery where Abraham Lincoln lies, and to the astonishing plot that nearly stole the martyred president's body out of it. Lincoln, who had held the Union together and been struck down by an assassin at the very hour of his triumph, was the most revered figure in the nation, and his tomb was a place of pilgrimage. But in the autumn of 1876, a gang of Chicago counterfeiters hatched a scheme of breathtaking audacity. Their master engraver had been imprisoned, and without him, their operation was crippled. So they resolved to steal Lincoln's corpse and hold it hostage, demanding $200,000 and the engraver's release as ransom. On election night, the 7th of November, they crept into the tomb, sawed through the padlock, and had begun to slide the president's heavy coffin from its marble sarcophagus when Secret Service agents, tipped off by an informer planted in the gang, closed in. In the confusion, the robbers fled into the dark, though they were later caught and convicted. The near theft so terrified the men who guarded Lincoln that for years afterward they hid his body in secret, moving it about the monument, concealing it in a damp basement passage under a pile of loose boards, telling almost no one where the greatest American of the age actually lay. Only in 1901, at his son Robert's insistence, was Lincoln reburied for good, lowered 10 feet down, and encased in a cage of steel bars and tons of poured concrete so that his rest could never again be broken. The plot had been masterminded by a Chicago crime boss known as Big Jim Kennelly, whose counterfeiting ring had been gutted by the imprisonment of its master engraver, Benjamin Boyd. Desperate to spring him, the gang settled on the most outrageous hostage imaginable and chose election night for the deed, gambling that the returns would distract the city. What they did not know was that one of their own number was an informer, and that the newly formed Secret Service, then chiefly a force against counterfeiting, was waiting in the shadows of the tomb. The robbers had wrestled the coffin partway out when the agents rushed in, and in the panic and darkness the thieves escaped, though they were run down and arrested days later. Grave robbery was such a minor crime in Illinois at the time that they served barely a year. But the fright it gave Lincoln's custodians never left them, and a secret group of loyal friends who called themselves the Lincoln Guard of Honor spent the next quarter century hiding the president's body, shifting it from place to place within the monument, and even walling it up in a damp cellar passage beneath a heap of boards, so that for years hardly anyone alive knew where he truly lay. Only in 1901 was he given his final security, when workmen who briefly glimpsed his remarkably preserved face lowered him into a steel cage and buried him under thousands of pounds of concrete. He rests here now, sealed forever beneath the earth. Let us travel now to Memphis, Tennessee, to the famous meditation garden on the grounds of Graceland, where Elvis Presley lies among his family, and to the grave robbery scare that put him there. The king of rock and roll died at Graceland on the 16th of August, 1977, at only 42, and the grief that swept the world was staggering. He was first laid to rest beside his beloved mother in a mausoleum at a public cemetery across town, Forest Hill, where enormous crowds of mourners descended day and night. But barely 2 weeks after the funeral, on the 29th of August, A group of men was caught in the act of attempting to break into that mausoleum in what authorities believed was a plot to steal the king's body. Whether for ransom or grim notoriety, no one could be sure. The attempt was foiled, but the danger was suddenly horribly clear. Between the threat of body snatchers and the impossibility of protecting a beloved icon in a public cemetery swarming with fans, the Presley family made a decision. They obtained special permission to bring Elvis home, moving his body and his mother's to the meditation garden at Graceland itself in October of 1977, onto private ground that could be watched and guarded around the clock. There, the king lies to this day, visited by millions, safe at last behind the walls of the mansion he loved. The scene at the public cemetery in those first weeks had been overwhelming. Tens of thousands of grieving fans pressing in day and night, the heat and the crush so terrible that mourners collapsed, and in one dreadful accident nearby, 2 young women were struck and killed by a car. Into that chaos came the body snatchers. The men caught trying to force their way into the mausoleum were suspected of planning to steal the king and demand a fortune for his return, though the case grew so murky that some came to believe the whole thing had been a botched publicity stunt, and the charges eventually dissolved. Either way, the message to the family was unmistakable. Elvis simply could not be kept safe in a public cemetery. Vernon Presley, the singer's father, petitioned the authorities and won special permission to bring his son home, and so both Elvis and his mother Gladys, who had died years before, were quietly moved to the meditation garden within the walls of Graceland. There they could be watched every hour of every day. In a strange way, the grave robbers gave the world the shrine it now knows. For the meditation garden became a place of pilgrimage for millions, an eternal flame burning beside the graves, the estate guarding its king as jealously in death as his fans had adored him in life. The rumors have never entirely died, and a stubborn fringe still insists the grave holds no one at all, a suspicion fed by a misspelling of his middle name on the stone, though the family and the record are clear that the king lies exactly where the crowds believe. He rests here now, home and protected. Let us travel now to the desert of Southern California, and then to a quiet cemetery in Metairie, Louisiana, to follow one of the strangest grave thefts in the history of music, the burning of Graham Parsons. Parsons was a visionary young musician, a pioneer of country rock who played with the Byrds and the Flying Burrito Brothers and shaped the sound of a generation before his own life unraveled. He died at a motel near Joshua Tree, the desert landscape he loved, on the 19th of September, 1973, at just 26 years old, of an overdose. And here the tale turns bizarre. Parsons and his road manager, a wild character named Phil Kaufman, had once made a drunken pact that whichever of them died first, the other would carry his body out to Joshua Tree and burn it there, free and unburied. So when Graham's family arranged to fly his body home to Louisiana, Kaufman and a friend borrowed a rickety hearse, drove to the Los Angeles airport, and with astonishing nerve simply talked the airline into handing over the coffin, claiming the family had changed its plans. They drove it out to the desert, to a great rock formation called Cap Rock, doused it, and set it alight beneath the stars. They were caught, but because there was no actual law against stealing a corpse, they could only be fined for the coffin. What remained of Graham was recovered and buried by his family here in Metairie. Parsons was no minor figure, but a true pioneer, the man who fused country and rock into something wholly new, shaping records like The Gilded Palace of Sin and Grievous Angel, and leaving a mark on everyone from the Rolling Stones to the young Emmylou Harris, who sang beside him. The macabre pact that decided his fate had been sworn, fittingly, at a bandmate's funeral, when he told Kaufman that he wanted no somber ceremony, but to be taken out to Joshua Tree and set free in flame. Kaufman, a road manager who reveled in the nickname the Road Mangler, kept that promise with reckless devotion. He and a friend rolled up to the airport loading dock in a borrowed hearse with a broken window, half drunk, and simply signed the coffin out, telling the airline the family had arranged a private flight. Out at Cap Rock in the desert, they poured gasoline into the open casket and threw a lit match, sending up a fireball that only partly consumed the body before they fled. When the law caught up with them, it found that no statute clearly forbade stealing a corpse, and the pair walked away with a fine for the damaged coffin. Kaufman later threw a raucous party he billed as the memorial. What the fire had spared was gathered up and buried by Graham's family far away in Louisiana, though pilgrims still scrawl tributes on the desert rock where he burned. He rests here now, what the desert fire left of him. Let us cross the world now to Buenos Aires, to the grand Recoleta Cemetery, to a fortified vault buried deep beneath the marble, the final and heavily guarded resting place of Eva Perón, after one of the most macabre journeys any body has ever taken. Evita, the beloved champion of Argentina's poor, the spiritual leader of millions, died of cancer in 1952 at only 33, and her grieving husband, President Juan Perón, had her body embalmed with extraordinary care so that it might be preserved forever and displayed to the people who worshipped her. But in 1955, a military coup overthrew Perón, and the new regime found itself terrified of a corpse. So potent was Evita's power as a symbol that the generals dared not let her rest, dared not even let her name be spoken. Secretly, they seized her embalmed body and made it vanish, beginning a grim 16-year odyssey. Her corpse was hidden in vans and offices and behind a cinema screen, reportedly abused and defiled by those who guarded it, and at last spirited across the ocean to Italy and buried under a false name in a Milan cemetery. Only years later was she recovered and delivered to the exiled Perón in Spain, who kept her restored body in his home. Finally, in 1976, Evita came home to Recoleta, where her family sealed her in a crypt built like a bank vault, meters underground behind steel doors and trapdoors, so that she could never be stolen again. The embalming had been the obsessive work of a Spanish anatomist, Dr. Pedro Ara, who regarded the preservation of Evita as his masterpiece, rendering her so lifelike that she seemed merely asleep, and the plan had been to enshrine her beneath a monument grander than the Statue of Liberty. Instead, she became a fugitive corpse. The officer charged with hiding her, a colonel who grew half-mad with the burden of his secret, moved her from place to place and, by some accounts, made wax copies to throw pursuers off the trail, before she was shipped in secret to Italy and buried under the false name of an Italian widow in a Milan cemetery, where she lay unknown for years. When she was finally recovered and delivered to the exiled Perón and his new wife in Madrid, they reportedly kept the open casket in their home, even at the dining table, unwilling to let her go. Only after Perón's own death was Evita brought home to Argentina and lowered into the Duarte family vault at Recoleta, into a crypt engineered by a firm that built bank vaults, sunk 5 meters into the earth behind a steel door and a series of trapdoors, expressly designed so that no army, no mob, and no thief could ever carry her off again. Decades on, fresh flowers still appear daily at the tomb of the woman her people were told not even to name. She had promised her people she would return to them, and in the strangest possible way she did, though the road home led through a foreign grave and a false name, and 16 years in the dark. She rests here now, guarded even in death. Let us travel now to Jacksonville, Florida, to the Riverside Memorial Park, to the grave of a Southern rock legend that was violated in an act of pure, senseless cruelty. Ronnie Van Zant was the fierce, charismatic frontman and soul of Lynyrd Skynyrd, the voice behind anthems that still ring out across the American South. When he was killed in the band's catastrophic plane crash in 1977, at only 29 years old, he was mourned as a hero and laid to rest in his home city, and for more than 2 decades his grave, and that of his bandmate Steve Gaines, who died in the same crash, were places of quiet pilgrimage for grieving fans. Then, in June of 2000, vandals broke into the cemetery in the night and desecrated both graves, disturbing Van Zant's casket and tampering with the container of Gaines's ashes, a violation so shocking and so pointless that it stunned the music world and horrified the families. The remains were recovered and treated with care, and both were reinterred, this time sealed within massive reinforced concrete vaults, with security tightened around the site, so that the men who had given so much joy could finally be left in peace. The crash that killed him has itself become legend, a chartered plane that ran out of fuel and went down in a Mississippi swamp on the 20th of October, 1977, killing Van Zant, the guitarist Steve Gaines, his sister, the backup singer Cassie Gaines, and others, just days after the band had released an album whose cover, eerily, showed them engulfed in flames. Van Zant's voice had powered anthems like Free Bird and Sweet Home Alabama that remain woven into the fabric of American music. and his grave, like Gaines's, drew steady streams of devoted fans. That such shrines could be violated for no reason at all was almost impossible to comprehend. When the Vandals struck in the summer of 2000, disturbing the resting places of both men, the outrage was immediate and national, and the grief of the families was compounded by a fresh and senseless wound. Determined that it would never happen again, they had the remains secured within heavy reinforced vaults and the cemetery's protections strengthened, so that the men whose music had given comfort to millions could themselves be left in the peace they had earned. The desecration remains one of the ugliest and most baffling crimes ever committed against the graves of American musicians, an act of destruction aimed at nothing more than beloved memory. In the years since, the surviving members of the band have carried on, and the graves have been left in peace, but the memory of that violation still stings among fans who regard the group as family. The men who did it were never fully brought to justice, and their motive, if there was any beyond casual cruelty, has never been explained, which may be the most disturbing thing of all about it. He rests here now, shielded from the cruelty of strangers. Let us travel now to Paris, to the world-famous Père Lachaise cemetery, to a grave that has been loved almost to ruin, the resting place of Jim Morrison. The magnetic, self-destructive frontman of The Doors, a poet who fashioned himself into a rock and roll shaman, died in a Paris apartment in the summer of 1971, at just 27, and was buried in this ancient cemetery among the great artists of France. Almost at once his grave became a shrine, and then something closer to a battlefield. For decades, pilgrims descended upon it in such numbers, and behaved so wildly, that the surrounding tombs of entirely unrelated souls were smothered in graffiti, arrows scrawled to point the way, the whole corner littered with bottles and cigarettes and worse. A bust of Morrison placed at the grave was defaced again and again, and finally stolen outright in 1988, never recovered. The cemetery was forced to post guards, erect barriers, and periodically scrub the desecration away, and rumors swirled for years that the family's lease on the plot would lapse and Morrison would be evicted from Père Lachaise entirely. His family eventually laid a simple, flat stone with a Greek inscription over him. His death itself remains shrouded in mystery, for he was found in the bathtub of a Paris apartment with no autopsy performed, the cause officially recorded as heart failure, and the doubts and legends have swirled ever since, binding him into the so-called 27 Club of Stars who died at that fateful age. In death he became a magnet unlike almost any other. The bust that an admirer sculpted and set upon the grave in 1981 was chipped at, scrawled upon, and at last simply carried off by thieves in 1988, never to be seen again. Pilgrims hacked at a tree beside the plot until it sickened, coated the neighboring tombs of the honored French dead in graffiti and arrows and lipstick, and left the corner strewn with bottles and refuse, forcing the exasperated cemetery to station guards and string barriers around the site. For years, a persistent fear circulated that the family's lease on the plot would run out, and Morrison would be evicted from Père Lachaise altogether, a rumor the authorities repeatedly denied. His father, a United States admiral once estranged from his rebellious son, eventually placed a simple, flat stone bearing a Greek inscription that translates roughly as "true to his own spirit," or "true to his own demon," a fitting epitaph for a man consumed by both. To this day, the grave draws crowds on the anniversary of his death, and the cemetery must still watch it closely, a corner of Père Lachaise that can never quite settle. What began as mourning long ago curdled into something harder to name, a restless, ceaseless pilgrimage that honors the poet and disturbs him in the very same breath. He rests here now, guarded from the very devotion that will not let him alone. Let us cross to Austria, to the town of Eisenstadt, to the Bergkirche, where the composer Joseph Haydn lies in a marble tomb, a tomb which, disturbingly, contains not one skull but two. Haydn was the father of the symphony, one of the towering geniuses of classical music, and when he died in Vienna in 1809, at 77, with Napoleon's armies occupying the city, he was given only a modest funeral and a quiet burial. But within days, grave robbers came for him, and what they wanted was his head. Two acquaintances, feverish believers in the fashionable pseudoscience of phrenology, which held that genius could be read in the bumps of the skull, bribed the gravedigger to sever Haydn's head from his freshly buried body so they could study the great composer's supposed organ of music. They kept the skull as a treasured curiosity in a specially made black box. The theft went unnoticed for 11 years, until 1820, when Haydn's patron ordered the body moved to Eisenstadt, and the opened coffin was found to be missing its head. The thieves brazenly handed over a substitute skull belonging to someone else entirely, and the real one passed from collector to collector for 145 years before it was finally reunited with his body in 1954. And here is the final strange twist, for when the true skull was restored, the substitute was simply left in place. The theft was the work of two ardent admirers, a former Esterhazy court secretary named Joseph Karl Rosenbaum and a prison governor named Johann Nepomuk Peter, who were disciples of the phrenologist Franz Joseph Gall, and burned to examine the celebrated organ of music they were certain would bulge from the skull of so great a composer. They bribed the gravedigger, and the head was carried off so soon after burial, in such summer heat, that the stench of it made Rosenbaum vomit in his carriage. Cleaned and bleached, the skull was enshrined in a beautiful custom box fitted with a lyre and a white cushion, a ghastly ornament in Peter's home. The crime lay hidden for 11 years, until Prince Nikolaus Esterhazy, wishing to honor his family's great servant, ordered the body moved, and the coffin was opened to reveal a headless skeleton. Confronted, the thieves brazenly surrendered a substitute skull, and the real one began a wandering that would last a century and a half, passing from Peter's widow to a doctor, to an anatomical institute, and finally to Vienna's Society of the Friends of Music, even ending up on the opposite side of the Cold War's dividing line from the body. Not until 1954 was the genuine skull carried in solemn ceremony to Eisenstadt and restored to its skeleton, and the mismatched substitute was simply left where it lay. He rests here now with two skulls in his tomb, one his own, one a stranger's. Let us travel now to New Rochelle, New York, to a lonely monument that guards an empty plot, and to the disturbing fate of a man who has, quite literally, no grave at all. Thomas Paine was one of the most important voices of the American Revolution, the author of Common Sense, the pamphlet that helped set a nation aflame for independence. But his later attacks on organized religion made him a pariah, and when he died in poverty in 1809, he was refused burial in consecrated ground and laid instead in a corner of his own farm at New Rochelle, in a grave few came to visit. 10 years later, an English radical named William Cobbett, once Paine's bitter enemy, and now his fervent admirer, resolved to right what he saw as a great injustice. In the dead of night he dug up Paine's bones, crated them, and shipped them across the ocean to England, intending to build a magnificent memorial and rally the reform movement around the relics of the great revolutionary. But the memorial was never built. Cobbett was ridiculed as a ghoulish resurrection man, and when he died the bones passed into obscurity, sold off in a box at auction, then broken up and scattered until no one could say where any part of Thomas Paine had gone. Rumors place his skull on the far side of the world and a bone in the wall of a tavern. His remains are simply lost. His pamphlet Common Sense had done as much as any army to spark the revolution, and his stirring cry that these were the times that try men's souls had rallied Washington's freezing troops, yet the same fearless pen that made him a hero later made him an outcast. When his book, The Age of Reason, turned the fury of the pious against him, he died all but friendless, denied even a Quaker burial, and only a small, sad handful of mourners saw him lowered beneath a walnut tree on his farm. Cobbett's midnight resurrection 10 years later was meant as an act of homage, a plan to enshrine the great Democrat in his homeland and use his very bones to inspire a movement. And Cobbett announced grandly to the customs officers at Liverpool that he carried the mortal remains of the immortal Thomas Paine. Instead, he was met with ridicule, caricatured as a ghoul, mocked by Lord Byron in verse, and the grand memorial never rose. After Cobbett died, the crate of bones was knocked down at auction to a bewildered buyer, and from there, Paine scattered to the winds, a skull rumored to travel as far as Australia, a hand and a rib claimed in England, small relics surfacing here and there and never confirmed. The man who wrote that his country was the world ended, fittingly and tragically, with his dust spread across it and no grave to call his own. A single monument was later raised at New Rochelle over the ground where he was first laid, but it marks only an absence, a memorial without a man, one of the few great figures of his age, with no resting place at all. He rests here, now, nowhere at all, his monument standing watch over empty earth. Let us travel now to the Italian city of Ravenna, to a small domed tomb where the bones of the poet Dante Alighieri lie, bones that were hidden, stolen, and lost for centuries in one of history's strangest tugs of war over the dead. Dante, the supreme poet of the Italian language, the author of the Divine Comedy, was exiled from his beloved Florence in a political purge and spent his last years wandering, dying at last in Ravenna in 1321. Almost immediately, Florence regretted casting out its greatest son and began demanding his body back, and for centuries, Ravenna refused. In 1519, the matter seemed settled when the Pope himself ordered the bones sent to Florence. But when the Florentine delegation solemnly opened Dante's tomb, they found it empty. The Franciscan friars who guarded the poet had secretly bored through a wall and spirited his bones away, hiding them rather than surrender them to the city that had banished him. Florence, humiliated, built a grand tomb for Dante in its great church of Santa Croce anyway. A tomb that stands magnificent and utterly empty to this day. The hidden bones, meanwhile, were walled up and forgotten, rediscovered only by pure chance in 1865, when a workman knocked through a wall and found a wooden box inscribed with the poet's name. His crime, in Florence's eyes, had been politics, and the sentence was exile on pain of being burned alive should he ever return, a banishment that drove him from the city he loved and immortalized into a wandering that ended in Ravenna, where he finished the Divine Comedy and died of fever in 1321. For 2 centuries, Florence pleaded and demanded, its guilt sharpening as Dante's fame swelled into worship, and even the great Michelangelo offered to design a fitting tomb if only the poet could be brought home. When the Pope at last commanded the transfer in 1519, the Franciscan friars of Ravenna, who had guarded the poet for generations and would not see him carried off to his ungrateful birthplace, quietly bored into his sarcophagus and drew the bones out through the wall, leaving the Florentines to open an empty coffin. Florence built its grand cenotaph regardless, and it stands in Santa Croce still, a magnificent monument with no one inside it. The bones, meanwhile, were hidden and reburied and forgotten so completely that their rediscovery in 1865 came by pure accident. A laborer breaking through an old wall to find a dusty wooden box inscribed by the friar who had concealed it 2 centuries before, the timing uncanny, falling in the very year Italy celebrated the poet's 600th birthday. Even during the Second World War, his much-traveled bones were hidden once more, buried under a mound in a Ravenna garden to shield them from the falling bombs, so that the poet who wrote of exile was, in a sense, exiled and concealed to the very end. He rests here now in Ravenna, while Florence, in eternal penance, still sends the oil for the lamp that burns above him. Let us travel now to Florence itself, to the great Basilica of Santa Croce, to the tomb of Galileo Galilei, from whose very corpse admirers carved away pieces to keep as holy relics of science. Galileo was the father of modern observational astronomy, the man who turned his telescope on the heavens and dared to insist that the Earth moves around the sun, and who was condemned by the Inquisition and forced to spend his last years under house arrest, dying in 1642. Because the Church had branded his ideas heretical, he was at first denied a proper tomb and buried in a cramped, obscure little room. But 95 years later, as the world came to see him as a hero, his admirers arranged to move him to the magnificent monument he now occupies, directly across from Michelangelo. And during that ceremonial transfer, with the coffin lying open, several of those present could not resist. They cut from Galileo's body 3 fingers, a tooth, and one of his vertebrae, to keep as relics of the great man. His severed middle finger, mounted upright inside an ornate glass egg, is displayed in a Florence museum to this very day, pointing, as visitors love to note, defiantly toward the sky he had studied. 2 of the other fingers and the tooth vanished for a century before resurfacing, astonishingly, at an auction. His was the mind that had shattered the old picture of the heavens, turning a telescope on the moon and the moons of Jupiter, and daring to defend the idea that the Earth was not the fixed center of creation, and for that the Inquisition had broken him, forcing him to his knees to recant, and confining him to his villa for the rest of his life, blind and watched, until his death in 1642. The Church's grip reached even beyond the grave, forbidding any grand monument and consigning his body to a cramped, hidden chamber tucked beneath a bell tower, out of sight. Only when the intellectual tide had fully turned, 95 years later, did Florence resolve to honor him properly and move him to the soaring tomb he now shares a basilica with Michelangelo and Machiavelli. But at that reburial, with the coffin open to the air, admirers turned relic hunters. A scholar and an anatomist among them cut away 3 fingers, a tooth, and a vertebra, treating the remains of the great skeptic like the bones of a saint. The vertebra went off to the university at Padua where he had once taught, and his defiant middle finger, dried and mounted upright in a jeweled glass egg, still points toward the sky in a Florence museum. The other pilfered pieces vanished for 100 years before turning up, incredibly, in a sealed jar sold at auction. It is a peculiar immortality for a man of science, to have a finger enshrined like the relic of a martyr, and there is a grim wit in it too, that the digit forever raised toward the heavens should belong to the one who was punished for daring to study them. He rests here now, though not entirely, some small pieces of him scattered still. Let us travel now to the quiet Yorkshire village of Coxwold in England, to the churchyard where the novelist Laurence Sterne was at last reburied, after a posthumous ordeal that reads like something from one of his own darkly comic books. Sterne was the brilliant, mischievous author of Tristram Shandy, a novel decades ahead of its time, and of A Sentimental Journey, and his writing was full of sly jokes about death and even about skulls. When he died in London in 1768, he was buried in a city churchyard, but his rest lasted only days. In that era, anatomy schools were desperate for fresh corpses to dissect, and a shadowy trade of body snatchers, the so-called resurrection men, robbed new graves to supply them. Sterne's body was among those stolen, carried off and sold to the anatomists at Cambridge. And there, according to the account that has haunted his memory ever since, as the dissection began, someone in the room looked at the face on the table and recognized it, to his horror, as the celebrated author Laurence Sterne. The body was hurriedly and quietly returned, and generations later, when his original burial ground was dug up for redevelopment, remains believed to be his, a skull among them, were carried north and reburied here at Coxwold, near the parsonage where he had written his masterpiece. Tristram Shandy had made him one of the most famous writers in Europe, a wild, playful, wickedly modern book centuries ahead of its time, and its author had a peculiar fondness for jokes about mortality, even naming the character Yorick after the exhumed jester whose skull Hamlet cradles. That a man so drawn to graveyard humor should meet the fate he did seems almost too fitting to be real. He died of consumption in his London lodgings in 1768 and was buried in a churchyard near Hyde Park that was notorious as a hunting ground for the resurrection men, the body snatchers who prowled fresh graves to feed the anatomy school's endless hunger for corpses. Within days, the newly buried author was dug up, spirited away, and sold to the anatomists at Cambridge. And there, as the dissection was about to proceed or had already begun, one of those present, a man who had known Sterne in life, looked at the face and recognized the celebrated novelist laid out upon the slab, a moment of horror worthy of his own fiction. The body was hushed up and returned to its grave. 2 centuries later, when the old burial ground was cleared for building, remains believed to be his, including a skull bearing the marks of the anatomist's saw, were gathered and carried north to be reburied at Coxwold, beside the parsonage where he had written his masterpiece. There is a bleak justice in the fact that the skull said to be his, marked by the anatomist's blade, can still be viewed today in a Cambridge collection, so that the jester of English literature keeps, even now, a kind of afterlife upon a shelf. He rests here now, home at last after his gruesome detour. Let us travel now to Fort Worth, Texas, to the Shannon Rose Hill Cemetery, to the grave of Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who assassinated a president and whose own grave has known a strange and restless history. Oswald shot President John Kennedy in 1963 and was himself gunned down 2 days later, and he was so universally reviled that only one cemetery in the region would accept his body, and so few mourners came that reporters had to be recruited to carry the coffin. His grave gave him no peace. On the 4th anniversary of the assassination, in 1967, his heavy original headstone, carved with his full name, was stolen outright and was later discovered hidden in a crawl space beneath his own mother's house. She replaced it with a plain marker bearing only the single word Oswald. Then, in 1981, a British writer became convinced that the man in the grave was not Oswald at all, but a Soviet imposter, a double swapped in during a Cold War plot, and he pressed successfully to have the body exhumed and examined. When the grave was opened and the remains studied, dental records confirmed beyond doubt that it was indeed Oswald. His water-damaged original coffin was replaced before reburial, and that discarded coffin would itself later surface at auction, sparking a bitter lawsuit. No death in modern American history is more scrutinized than the one he caused, and few graves are stranger than his own. Gunned down by Jack Ruby in a Dallas police basement barely 2 days after the assassination, he was buried in haste amid such universal loathing that a single cemetery in Fort Worth was the only one willing to receive him, and the funeral was so sparsely attended that reporters covering the event were pressed into service as pallbearers. His resting place could not escape the obsession that surrounds the assassination. The theft of his heavy inscribed headstone on the 4th anniversary of the murder, and its bizarre later discovery in the crawlspace beneath his own mother's home, was only the beginning. She replaced it with the barest of markers, a stone bearing nothing but his surname, and beside it an odd neighboring marker reading Nick Beef, placed years afterward by a performance artist, has since drawn its own curious pilgrims. The exhumation of 1981, demanded by a writer certain that a Soviet double lay in the plot, saw a trenching machine tear open the grave at dawn as the coffin was hauled into a tent and carried off to Dallas for autopsy, where the dental records ended the fantasy and proved the body was Oswald's. His rotted coffin was replaced, and even that discarded box would resurface at auction decades later to spark a lawsuit. Visitors still come, quietly and without ceremony, to a grave that neither glorifies nor forgives, leaving pennies and small flags upon a stone that says only what it must and nothing more. He rests here now, disturbed even in infamy. Let us travel now to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, to a small, dusty cemetery on the plains, to a grave so relentlessly robbed that it is one of the only graves in America kept behind bars. Here lies Billy the Kid, the legendary young outlaw of the Old West, gunned down by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881 at the age of 21 and buried between 2 of his fallen companions beneath a single shared stone carved with the one word "pals." From the beginning, his grave was a target, the wooden markers stolen or shot to pieces, and the tale of his tombstone became a decades-long saga of theft. In 1950, the heavy stone was stolen and vanished for 26 years before being tracked down in Texas and hauled back. Then, in 1981, it was stolen again, pried loose with a crowbar by a truck driver who used the very handle Billy the Kid and carried off to California before being recovered days later. That was the last straw. The footstone was shackled to its base with a band of iron, and the entire gravesite was locked inside a heavy steel cage, where it sits today. An outlaw imprisoned in death as he so often was in life. Stranger still, old floods long ago scrambled the cemetery so thoroughly that some doubt whether Billy's bones lie beneath the cage at all. Born Henry McCarty and known to the law as William Bonney, the Kid had blazed through the Lincoln County War and into legend, his fame stoked by a bounty placed on his head by the territorial governor before Sheriff Pat Garrett shot him dead in the dark at Fort Sumner. He was buried the next day between his fallen friends, and in time a single granite stone carved with the word "pals" was set over the 3 outlaws. From the start, the grave could not be left in peace, its early wooden markers stolen or shot to splinters by souvenir hunters, and the great stone itself became the prize in a comic, decades-long crime spree. Its first theft in 1950 saw it vanish for 26 years before it turned up on a Texas ranch and was hauled home to a rededication celebration, complete with a staged Wild West bank robbery. When it was stolen a second time in 1981 by a trucker who fittingly used the handle Billy the Kid and pried it loose with a crowbar, the governor of New Mexico personally arranged to fly a sheriff to California to retrieve it. This time the town took no chances, clamping the footstone in iron shackles and locking the whole plot inside a heavy steel cage. And because a series of old floods long ago washed away the cemetery's markers and tumbled its bones together, there has always been a nagging doubt as to whether the outlaw truly lies beneath the cage that guards him. Rival towns in Texas have even claimed for decades that the real Kid escaped death entirely and lies buried elsewhere under another name, so that the caged grave at Fort Sumner guards not only bones but an argument that may never be settled. He rests here now, or someone does, behind iron bars. And so we come to the final grave of this first half of our journey, and it is perhaps the most astonishing of them all, for it belongs to a king of England who was lost for more than 5 centuries and found beneath a parking lot. Let us travel to Leicester, to the cathedral where Richard III was finally laid to rest in 2015. Richard, the last of the Plantagenet kings and the last English monarch to die in battle, was killed at Bosworth Field in 1485. His body stripped, abused, and carried off to be buried hastily and without honor in the Church of the Greyfriars in Leicester. And then, across the turning centuries, he was utterly lost. The friary was torn down, the grave forgotten, the very location erased from memory, and a persistent legend arose that his bones had been dug up and flung into a nearby river. For over 500 years, a crowned king of England lay in a grave that no living soul could find. Then, in 2012, a determined team of researchers set out to locate the vanished friary, and their search led them to dig beneath a modern city council car park. Almost unbelievably, on the very first day, they struck bone, and there, under a painted parking space marked with the letter R, they found a battle-scarred skeleton with a cruelly curved spine. DNA drawn from living descendants of the royal line confirmed the impossible, that this was Richard III himself. In 2015, the long-lost king was carried in solemn procession and reburied with full honor beneath the floor of Leicester Cathedral. He had been the last king of the House of Plantagenet, his brief and turbulent reign forever shadowed by the mystery of his vanished nephews, the princes in the Tower, and later blackened into pure villainy by Shakespeare, who gave him a hunched back and the desperate battlefield cry for a horse. At Bosworth, his crown passed to Henry Tudor, and the fallen king's body was stripped bare, slung over a horse, paraded, and shoved into a hurried grave at the Greyfriars Church with no monument at all. When that friary was pulled down in the great dissolution of the monasteries, the grave was swallowed by the centuries, built over and paved over until the very memory of where a king lay was lost, replaced by a rumor that vandals had long ago pitched his bones into the River Soar. It took a determined amateur historian and a team from the local university to chase the legend down, poring over old maps until they were led, astonishingly, to the asphalt of a council car park. On the first day of digging, they uncovered a skeleton with a twisted spine and the marks of a dozen brutal wounds, and DNA drawn from living descendants of his sister's line confirmed the impossible. 2.5 years later, in a service of enormous ceremony, the king who had lain beneath a painted parking space was carried into Leicester Cathedral and laid to rest beneath a tomb of pale stone. He rests here now, a monarch reclaimed from beneath the tarmac. And so, friends, we pause. We have stood tonight beside bodies ransomed and burned, hidden and defiled, beside skulls carried off in the dark and bones scattered across the world and lost, beside a poet's empty tomb and an outlaw's caged one, beside a king pulled up from under a parking space 500 years after he fell. We have seen what fame can do to the peace of the grave, and we have seen the lengths to which the living will go, some to desecrate and some to protect. But our walk is only half finished. 15 more disturbed graves lie ahead of us on this shadowed road. 15 more tales of stolen heads and disputed bones, of coffins opened and remains that would not stay buried. Look back, before we go on, at the shape of what we have seen. Notice how the crimes fall into kinds. There are the ransoms, the thieves who saw in a famous corpse nothing but a price, as with Chaplin and the near theft of Lincoln. There are the fanatics and the fervent, who took a head or a finger or a whole body in the name of science or devotion. As with Haydn and Galileo and Evita, there are the mobs of love, who nearly destroyed a grave by adoring it too fiercely, as at Morrison's tomb. There are the lost, whose bones simply slipped away into history, as with Paine and the hidden Dante, and perhaps the Kid. And there are the doubters, who tore a grave open to answer a question, as with Oswald. Each kind carries its own particular chill, and each reminds us that a grave is not only a place of rest, but a place of meaning, freighted with everything the living project onto the dead. That is why they cannot leave these graves alone, and that is why so many more still wait for us up ahead. So rest here a moment among these first 15, and steady yourself once more. Catch your breath, and when you are ready to go on, we shall continue together, deeper into the strange and troubling country of graves that could not rest. Welcome back, friends, and step once more onto the shadowed road, for our grim procession is only half finished. In the first part of our walk, we stood beside bodies that were ransomed and burned and hidden, beside stolen skulls and scattered bones, beside a caged outlaw and a king pulled up from beneath a parking lot. 15 more disturbed graves lie ahead of us now, and they are, if anything, stranger and darker still. Tonight we will see a ruler dug up to be executed years after his death, his head left rotting on a spike for 2 decades. We will see the skulls of a philosopher and a mystic carried off and traded like curiosities, and the bones of explorers and frontier heroes fought over by rival cities and nations that cannot agree who holds them. We will see a beloved singer's embalmed body kept on display beneath glass for the better part of a decade, and a screen goddess whose very tomb became a coveted, auctioned prize. And we will end with the greatest writer who ever lived, a man who saw all of this coming and tried to curse the grave robbers away, only to have his warning, perhaps, defied in the dark. As always, let me promise you honesty. Several of tonight's tales are old, and the old ones especially gather legend the way a stone gathers moss. So where a story is disputed or uncertain, where the bones may not be whose we are told, I will tell you plainly. I will also tell you, because it matters, that not every disturbance in these stories was an act of cruelty. Some were the work of science, some of misguided devotion, and a few of these graves were violated only to be honored again afterward, their dignity fought for, and, in the end, restored. Keep watch for that thread of grace as we go, because it runs through even the darkest of these accounts. You will notice, as we go, that the disturbances grow in some ways stranger the further back in time we reach, and that the line between crime and reverence grows blurry indeed. Was it desecration or devotion to carry off a great man's skull for study? Was it robbery or rescue to dig up a hero and move him to a grander tomb? The people in these stories seldom agreed among themselves, and centuries later we still do not, which is part of what makes this second half of our walk so unsettling. For these are not simply tales of villains and victims, they are tales of what the living do when a famous body lies before them and the ordinary rules of decency seem, for a moment, suspended by the sheer magnetism of a name. So gather yourself once more, and lower your voice, and let us walk on into the second half of this troubling country, beginning with one of the most vengeful things ever done to a human body, performed years after its owner had already died in peace. Let us begin in England, at Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, in whose chapel, in a secret and unmarked spot, the head of Oliver Cromwell was finally laid to rest in 1960. 3 centuries after his death, Cromwell had been the most powerful man in England. The Lord Protector who led the parliamentary armies, signed the death warrant of King Charles I, and ruled the land as a republic until he died, peacefully and of natural causes, in 1658, and was buried with the pomp of a king in Westminster Abbey. But 2 years later the monarchy returned, and the son of the executed king wanted revenge, not only on the living regicides but on the dead. In January of 1661, Cromwell's body was dragged from its tomb in the abbey, hauled through the streets to the gallows at Tyburn, hanged in chains for a full day, and then beheaded, the head struck from the corpse and impaled upon a 20-foot spike above Westminster Hall, the very place where Charles had been condemned. There it remained, gruesomely exposed to the weather and the crows, for more than 20 years, until at last a storm tore it loose one night, and it tumbled to the ground, to be snatched up by a passing sentry who hid it in his chimney. His enemies had needed some 8 blows of the axe to sever the long-dead head from its body, and once it was set upon its spike, it became one of the grimmest landmarks in London, gazing down over the city for more than 2 decades. After the storm at last brought it down, its journey had only begun. The soldier who hid it in his chimney passed it on, and over the years the mummified head became a ghoulish collector's item, exhibited for money in a traveling show of curiosities, doubted by some as a fraud, and prized by others as the genuine relic, its leathery, bearded face inspecting one generation of owners after another. Eventually, it came into the hands of the Wilkinson family, who kept it for nearly a century and a half in a velvet-lined box, bringing it out to horrify their dinner guests, until in 1960, 300 years after Cromwell died, the family gave it to his old Cambridge college to be buried at last. It was interred, so the story goes, in a secret spot in the chapel grounds, the exact location deliberately never recorded, so that no future collector could ever come looking. His headless body, meanwhile, was never recovered, lost in the common pit beneath the Tyburn gallows, so that the man who once ruled all of England lies today in two places, or perhaps, in truth, in none that anyone can find. It is one of the strangest of all reversals of fortune that a man who had ruled 3 kingdoms and been buried with the honors of a monarch should end as a curiosity in a velvet box, handed round at dinner parties, his very identity doubted. Before a college he had once briefly attended as a boy, at last took pity and gave what was left of him a hidden and permanent home. He rests here now, his long ordeal finally over. Let us travel now to Sweden, to the great cathedral of Uppsala, where the philosopher and mystic Emanuel Swedenborg lies, minus, for a very long time, his own head. Swedenborg was one of the most extraordinary figures of his age, a brilliant scientist and inventor who in middle life turned wholly to religion, claiming to have traveled in visions through heaven and hell and to have spoken with angels, and whose strange and luminous writings would inspire followers for centuries. He died in London in 1772 and was buried there quietly in a Swedish church. But his fame made his very skull a prize. Some years after his burial, a Swedish sea captain pried open the coffin and stole the head, apparently convinced that the skull of so remarkable a man must possess some special value, and from there began a saga worthy of farce. Over the following decades, more than one skull would be put forward as the genuine article, bought and sold and passed among collectors. When at last, in the early 20th century, Sweden brought its great son home to be honored with a tomb in Uppsala Cathedral, a skull was reverently placed inside, only for it to emerge later that it was the wrong one entirely. In life, Swedenborg had lived 2 utterly different existences. First, as a distinguished man of science, a mining engineer and anatomist who probed the workings of the brain, and then, after a series of overwhelming spiritual crises in middle age, as a mystic who insisted he walked freely among angels and the dead, and who mapped the geography of heaven and hell in book after book. Followers founded a whole church upon his visions, and his renown was exactly what doomed his skull to its long exile. For in an age fascinated by the notion that genius might be read in the shape of a head, the cranium of such a man was a temptation few relic hunters could resist. After the sea captain first pried it from the coffin, the skull vanished into the murky trade in famous bones, and so many rival heads were later put forward as the true one, that the confusion took more than a century to untangle. The final absurdity came when Sweden, meaning to honor him, enshrined a skull in his cathedral tomb that proved to be a stranger's, while his real skull turned up, of all places, on the block at a London auction house in the 1970s. Only after it was bought and carefully authenticated was the genuine skull carried back to Uppsala and joined once more to the bones it belonged to, ending a separation of nearly 200 years. There is a peculiar irony in it, that a man who devoted the second half of his life to insisting the soul lives on entirely apart from the flesh, who taught that the body is a mere discarded shell once the spirit has risen, should have had that discarded shell fought over so fiercely, his own skull hunted and haggled over for the better part of 2 centuries. He rests here now, his true skull recovered from a sale room and restored to him at last. Let us travel now to Paris, to the ancient abbey church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where the body of René Descartes is buried, though not, even now, his head. Descartes was the father of modern philosophy, the man who reduced all certainty to a single unshakable thought, I think, therefore I am, and reshaped how the Western mind reasons about everything. He died far from home, in the cold of Stockholm, in 1650, having been lured there to tutor a Swedish queen, and he was buried in Sweden. 16 years later, France wished to reclaim her great philosopher, and his remains were dug up to be carried home to Paris. But somewhere in that long journey, his skull went missing. It appears that someone entrusted with the remains quietly kept the head, and over the following century and more, it passed from owner to owner, each of whom, astonishingly, inscribed his name upon the bone, so that the skull of the philosopher of reason became a kind of grim autograph book. The body reached Paris and was reburied. But the skull wandered on, resurfacing at last in Sweden and being sent to France in the early 19th century, where, rather than being reunited with its body, it was placed in a museum. Descartes had been summoned to Sweden by its brilliant and demanding young queen, who insisted on receiving her philosophy lessons at 5 in the morning in the biting cold of a Scandinavian winter. a regimen that broke the health of a man long accustomed to lying abed and thinking until noon, and within months, he was dead of pneumonia. As a Catholic in a Protestant land, he was buried in a modest graveyard, and when France at last arranged to bring her philosopher home, the exhumation and the long journey gave ample opportunity for pieces of him to go astray. The skull was quietly kept back, and as it passed from one Swedish owner to the next over the generations, each new possessor added his own name to the growing collection of inscriptions, crowding the bone, until the head of the man who had taught the world to doubt everything looked less like a relic than a well-signed guest book. Meanwhile, the body, headless, completed its journey to Paris and was reburied, moved more than once over the turbulent centuries that followed. When the skull finally resurfaced and was sent to France, it was not returned to the grave but handed to a museum, and there the skull of the philosopher who had puzzled so famously over the divide between mind and body remains to this day, separated from his bones by the width of a city, a strange literal echo of his most famous idea. The museum where his skull now sits displays it as a treasured object of curiosity, so that the founder of modern rational thought has become, in death, a specimen to be studied, gazed upon by visitors, much as he once gazed upon the workings of the world, his own head, an exhibit in the endless human project of trying to understand ourselves. He rests here now, his mind's own vessel kept forever apart from his bones. Let us cross the ocean now, or rather cross it several times, as our next subject has done in death, to follow the astonishing wanderings of the remains of Christopher Columbus, claimed to this day by two different nations on two different sides of the Atlantic. Columbus, the mariner whose voyages changed the world, died in Spain in 1506, and there his troubles, or at least his travels, only began. He was buried first in Valladolid, then moved to Seville, and then, in accordance with his family's wish that he lie in the new world he had reached, his remains were shipped across the ocean to the island of Hispaniola and interred in the Cathedral of Santo Domingo. There he lay for 2 centuries, until Spain lost the island to France and his bones, or bones believed to be his, were carried off again to Havana in Cuba. And when Spain lost Cuba as well, at the end of the 19th century, the remains were shipped back across the sea once more to Seville, where a magnificent tomb holds them aloft on the shoulders of 4 bronze kings. But here is the twist that has never been resolved. In the 1870s, workmen in the Cathedral of Santo Domingo uncovered a lead box inscribed with Columbus's name and titles, and the Dominican Republic has insisted ever since that the Spaniards took the wrong bones away and that the real Columbus never left the island at all. It is a fitting afterlife for a man who spent his life crossing the ocean, that his bones should keep crossing it long after he was gone. Columbus died out of favor and half forgotten, still insisting he had reached the edge of Asia, and his corpse began its wanderings almost at once, shuttled between Spanish cities before being carried west to lie, as he had wished, in the lands he had opened to Europe. Each time the map of empire shifted, his remains, or remains said to be his, were bundled up and moved again, from Santo Domingo to Havana, and at last back across the Atlantic to the great Cathedral of Seville, where 4 towering bronze kings now bear his tomb upon their shoulders, holding him symbolically aloft so that his body need never again touch the soil of a country that had disappointed him. And yet the Dominicans point to the lead casket, plainly inscribed with his name and titles, that their workmen uncovered in the 1870s, and insist that Spain in its haste carried off the wrong man, and that the true admiral never left their island at all. Modern science has only deepened the puzzle, for tests on the Seville remains have confirmed that at least some of those bones really are Columbus's, which strongly suggests that the explorer, even now, lies scattered in pieces across the very ocean he was the first to bridge. He rests here now, perhaps in Spain, perhaps in the Caribbean, and quite possibly divided between the two. Let us travel now to the American frontier, to 2 graves nearly 300 miles apart, one in Frankfort, Kentucky, and one near Marthasville, Missouri, each of which claims to hold the bones of the legendary pioneer Daniel Boone. Boone was the great trailblazer of the early American wilderness, a hunter and explorer whose name became a byword for the frontier itself. And when he died in Missouri in 1820, he was buried there beside his wife Rebecca, on a quiet hillside he had chosen. For 25 years he lay undisturbed, but in 1845, the state of Kentucky, hungry to reclaim its most famous son, sent a delegation to Missouri to dig up the boons and carry them back to a grand new cemetery in Frankfort. The Missourians, according to the tale that has been told ever since, quietly resented the theft and may have had the last laugh. For they claimed that, in the confusion of the old, crowded, poorly marked graveyard, Kentucky's men dug in the wrong spot and carried off the wrong bones entirely, leaving the true Daniel Boone behind in Missouri. Generations later, an examination of the skull taken to Kentucky only deepened the doubt, hinting that it might not even have belonged to Boone at all. Boone had become a legend in his own lifetime, the archetype of the American frontiersman, blazing the trail through the Cumberland Gap and opening Kentucky to settlement, and it was that very fame that set two states to quarreling over his corpse. He had spent his final years in Missouri and chosen his own grave there beside Rebecca on a peaceful rise, and there he lay for a quarter of a century, seemingly at peace. But Kentucky wanted him back, and the men who came in 1845 to reclaim him were also, not incidentally, promoting a grand new cemetery in Frankfort that could use so illustrious a resident to draw visitors. The Missourians, resentful at losing their hero, later spread the claim that the Kentuckians had bungled the job, that the old graves were so crowded and so poorly marked, with Daniel lying at the foot of his wife rather than beside her, that the diggers had opened the wrong plot and carried off a stranger's bones while the real Boone stayed behind. More than a century later, an examination of a cast of the skull, enshrined in Kentucky, only stirred the pot further, when an anthropologist suggested its features might not be Boone's at all, and might even have belonged to one of the other people buried in that tangled Missouri graveyard. Both states keep his grave, and both are equally, cheerfully sure. The competing claims have long since become a point of local pride on both sides, each state tending its Boone grave and telling its own version of the tale to visitors, so that the great pathfinder, who spent his life finding the way through trackless country, has left behind him one last trail that no one has ever managed to follow to a certain end. He rests here now, in Kentucky or in Missouri, with two states forever certain and no one truly sure. Let us travel now to Fort Sill, in Oklahoma, to the Apache prisoner of war cemetery, where the great Apache leader Geronimo was buried, and to the dark and stubborn legend that his grave was robbed of its skull. Geronimo had fought the armies of two nations across the deserts of the Southwest for decades, the most feared and famous of all the Apache fighters, before his final surrender, after which he lived out his years as a prisoner of war, dying of pneumonia at Fort Sill in 1909, still a captive, and was buried in the Post Cemetery. And then the story that has haunted his memory ever since takes hold. It is said that in 1918, a handful of young men from Yale's secretive Skull and Bones Society, stationed at Fort Sill during the First World War, crept out one night to the Apache graves, dug into Geronimo's, and carried off his skull to keep in their society's shadowy clubhouse. For decades, this was dismissed as mere rumor, until a historian discovered, in the society's own archives, a letter written in 1918 by one of its members, boasting that the skull of the worthy Geronimo the Terrible had been exhumed and was safe inside their tomb. Geronimo had been the last and most feared of the great Apache fighting leaders, waging a long and desperate resistance across the deserts of the borderlands until, worn down and vastly outnumbered, he surrendered for the final time in 1886, after which he and his people were held as prisoners of war for the rest of his life, shifted from Florida to Alabama to Oklahoma. In his last years, he became a strange kind of celebrity, exhibited at World's Fairs and even riding in a presidential inauguration parade, a caged legend, before pneumonia took him in 1909 while he was still a captive. For decades, the tale of the stolen skull was treated as pure campfire rumor, until a researcher combing the archives of the Yale Society uncovered a letter written by one of its members in the very year of the alleged robbery, crowing that the skull of the worthy Geronimo had been dug up and now sat safe within their windowless clubhouse. His descendants, believing his spirit could never rest while his remains were scattered and defiled, went to federal court to demand their return and a proper reburial near his birthplace. But the suit was dismissed, and the society has never confirmed nor denied what it holds. Honesty compels one hard caveat, that his grave in 1918 bore no marker at all, so that whatever skull may have been taken that night might never have been his. For his descendants, the wound is not merely historical but spiritual. a conviction that his spirit cannot find peace while any part of him lies imprisoned far from his homeland, and their long and so far unsuccessful campaign to bring him home is less a legal matter than an act of love and mourning stretched across a century. He rests here now, or most of him does. The fate of the rest, an open and painful wound. Let us travel now to the northern plains, to two more rival graves, one at Fort Yates in North Dakota and one near Mobridge in South Dakota, each claiming the bones of Sitting Bull, the great Hunkpapa Lakota leader and holy man. Sitting Bull had been the spiritual heart of his people's resistance, the visionary whose warriors overwhelmed Custer at the Little Bighorn, and when he was killed during a botched arrest at the Standing Rock Reservation in 1890, he was buried without ceremony in a corner of the military cemetery at Fort Yates. For more than 60 years, he lay there in a neglected grave. Then, in 1953, a group of men from the town of Mobridge, across the line in South Dakota, together with some of his descendants, took matters into their own hands in the dead of night. They drove to Fort Yates, dug down into the grave, gathered up what they believed were Sitting Bull's remains, and carried them back across the state line to a new site above the Missouri River, where they poured a great slab of concrete and raised a granite monument. North Dakota was outraged and has argued ever since that the Midnight Party took the wrong bones, or only some of them, or bones so long disturbed that no one could say what they truly were. Sitting Bull had been far more than a war leader. He was a holy man whose vision foretold the great victory over Custer at the Little Bighorn, the spiritual center of his people's long struggle to remain free. And after years of exile and a spell touring with a Wild West show, he was killed by reservation police during a chaotic attempt to arrest him at the height of the fervor surrounding the ghost dance. He was buried in quicklime in a plain grave at the military post, and for more than 60 years that grave was left to neglect, even, over time, to the depredations of souvenir hunters. When the men from Mobridge mounted their midnight expedition in 1953, they acted partly out of a genuine wish to honor him and partly, it must be said, out of a hope that his tomb would draw tourists to their town, and they carried off what they took to be his bones, sealed them beneath tons of concrete on a bluff above the river, and crowned the spot with a granite bust. North Dakota has never accepted that the true remains were moved, arguing that the original grave had been disturbed so often over the decades that no one could be certain what was carried away, or whether anything of the great leader was left to carry. And so two monuments stand today, each claiming him, while his descendants are left with the painful knowledge that his rest was broken twice over, first by neglect and then by the shovels in the dark. He rests here now, in one grave or the other, or divided between them, claimed by two states and certain to neither. Let us travel now to Garden City, on Long Island in New York, to the Grand Cathedral of the Incarnation, where the merchant prince Alexander Turney Stewart was finally and securely laid to rest after his corpse was stolen and ransomed in one of the most sensational crimes of the Gilded Age. Stewart had been one of the richest men in all of America, the pioneer of the great department store, his fortune almost beyond counting, and when he died in 1876, he was buried in a churchyard in Manhattan. 2 years later, in the autumn of 1878, grave robbers broke into the vault under cover of darkness and made off with his body, and soon a demand arrived for a staggering ransom in exchange for the return of the millionaire's remains. The scandal gripped the nation. His widow, after long and painful negotiation, is said to have eventually paid a reduced sum, some $20,000, for the return of a sack of bones that may or may not have truly been her husband. So difficult was it to be sure. Determined that he would never be stolen again, she had the recovered remains entombed in the great cathedral she built as his memorial, and, according to the enduring story, fitted the tomb with a special alarm rigged to ring at any disturbance. Stewart had been the merchant prince of his age, an Irish immigrant who built the first great department stores and amassed one of the largest fortunes in the country, a man so rich that his marble mansion and his cast-iron emporium were wonders of the city. All that wealth made his corpse a target. When the robbers struck in the autumn of 1878, prying open his vault and carrying off the decomposing body, the crime seized the imagination of the entire nation, and the ransom demand that followed, a sum that ran into the hundreds of thousands, was without precedent. The negotiations dragged on painfully, complicated by the difficulty of proving that the thieves even held what they claimed. And in the end, his widow is said to have paid a far smaller sum, some $20,000, for the return of a canvas sack of bones handed over in a darkened country lane, bones that could never be entirely confirmed as her husband's. Determined to end the nightmare for good, she had the recovered remains sealed within the soaring cathedral she raised as his memorial on Long Island, and the enduring legend holds that the tomb was wired with an alarm designed to sound at the first touch of a robber's hand. His stolen body helped teach a gilded generation a grim lesson: that great wealth could purchase a magnificent grave, but not, by itself, a safe one. The robbery of so eminent a man sent a shiver of unease through the wealthy families of the age, who suddenly understood that their grand tombs and marble vaults were no real protection against a determined thief, and in the years that followed, more than one prominent family took new and elaborate precautions to guard their dead. He rests here now, guarded against a second theft. Let us travel now to Indianapolis, to the hilltop grounds of Crown Hill Cemetery, to the grave of the Depression-era outlaw John Dillinger, which lies sealed beneath tons of concrete and which his own family recently fought to open. Dillinger had been public enemy number one, the most notorious bank robber of his age, gunned down by federal agents outside a Chicago theater in the summer of 1934. So great was his fame, and so real the fear that souvenir hunters or medical men would try to steal his infamous body, that in the days after the funeral, his grieving father had the grave transformed into a fortress, the casket reburied beneath some 2.5 tons of concrete and scrap iron, capped with reinforced slabs, so that no thief could ever reach him. And it worked, for his grave has never been robbed. But the strangeness was not over. In 2019, a nephew of Dillinger's petitioned to have the body exhumed, driven by a long, simmering conspiracy theory that the man the agents shot that night was not Dillinger at all, that an imposter lies in the grave while the real outlaw slipped away to live in secret. A permit was granted. A television documentary was planned. And then the cemetery fought the exhumation in court, and a judge halted it. Dillinger had blazed across the imagination of Depression-era America, a bank robber who escaped from jail with a pistol whittled out of wood and blackened with shoe polish, who underwent crude plastic surgery and tried to burn away his own fingerprints to escape the manhunt closing around him, and who was finally betrayed by a woman in a red dress and shot down as he left a Chicago movie house on a summer night. The frenzy did not end with his death. Crowds mobbed the morgue to glimpse the famous corpse, and some, it is said, dipped their handkerchiefs in his blood as keepsakes, so that his father, dreading what grave robbers or eager anatomists might do, turned the grave into a bunker of concrete and iron. That fortress kept the body safe, but it could not silence the doubters. And in our own time, a relative came forward convinced that the federal agents had killed the wrong man that night, pointing to what he called mismatches in the eyes and fingerprints and teeth of the body on the slab, and demanding the grave be opened to settle the question. A permit was granted and a television crew made ready, but the cemetery resisted in court, and a judge ruled that the concrete would not be broken without its consent. So the mystery, real or imagined, endures, sealed away with him beneath 2.5 tons of stone. His grave remains to this day a curiosity for visitors to the Indianapolis Cemetery, a modest marker set over an extraordinary fortress of stone, and the very lengths his family went to in order to protect him have only deepened the strange, stubborn mythology that refuses to let the outlaw rest quietly in the public imagination. He rests here now, sealed in concrete, his identity officially certain and stubbornly, endlessly questioned. Let us travel now to Vienna, to the old St. Mark's Cemetery, to a grave that cannot be precisely found, the last resting place of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the greatest musical prodigy the world has ever produced. Mozart died in Vienna in 1791, at only 35, deep in debt, and though the legend of a lonely pauper's funeral is exaggerated, the truth is disturbing enough in its own quiet way. In keeping with the cost-saving burial customs of the city at that time, his body was placed in a simple communal grave, without a lasting marker, alongside other ordinary dead, and within a few years the exact location of the spot had been entirely lost. When later generations, awakening to his genius, went looking for the greatest composer of the age, they found they could not say for certain where he lay. A gravedigger claimed to have secretly rescued Mozart's skull, which drifted through various hands and eventually came to rest in a museum in Salzburg, though modern testing has never been able to confirm that it is truly his. The popular image of Mozart flung into a bleak pauper's pit in a howling storm, mourned by no one, is a romantic exaggeration, But the reality is disturbing in its own quieter way. Under the strict and thrifty burial laws that the emperor had imposed upon Vienna in those years, all but the wealthiest citizens were laid in simple, shared graves without permanent markers, graves that could be dug up and reused after a decade to make room for the next generation of the dead. And so, the greatest musical genius the world had produced was lowered into one of these common plots at St. Mark's. His exact position, noted by no one who thought it mattered, and within a few short years the precise spot had passed entirely out of memory. When a later, wiser age went searching for him, all it found were guesses. A gravedigger claimed to have quietly rescued the composer's skull before the plot was disturbed, and that skull, or a skull, made its way at last to a museum in his native Salzburg. But every attempt to prove it genuine, even with modern science, has ended in frustration and doubt. Today, a weeping stone angel marks the likeliest place, and a grander monument stands in the city's great cemetery, but neither can honestly claim to sit above him. There is a further, piercing irony in his lost grave, for Mozart had written some of the most sublime funeral music ever composed, a requiem he was still laboring over on his own deathbed and never lived to finish, so that the man who gave the world its most beautiful music of mourning could not, in the end, be properly mourned at a marked grave of his own. Later ages tried to make amends with statues and ceremonies, but the plain truth remains that the exact dust of the greatest of all composers is simply gone, mingled with the anonymous Viennese, dead in a plot no living soul can point to with any certainty. He rests here now somewhere beneath the ground, his precise grave unknown, marked only by a mourning stone angel set upon the likeliest spot. Let us return now to Vienna's great central cemetery, to the honored grave of Ludwig van Beethoven, who lies among the immortals of music, though not, it must be said, entirely whole. Beethoven, the deaf titan who reshaped what music could be, died in 1827 and was first buried in a suburban churchyard after a funeral that drew a crowd of tens of thousands. But even in death he was not left intact. On his deathbed, admirers snipped locks of his hair as keepsakes, a common enough custom of the time, and those strands scattered across Europe and America, one famous lock revealing, when it was analyzed a century and a half later, startlingly high levels of lead, a possible clue to the illnesses and the deafness that had tormented him. Worse was to come, for in 1863 his body was exhumed so that scholars could study his remains. And during that examination, several of those present quietly pocketed fragments of the great composer's skull, pieces that wandered the world for generations, some ending up as far away as California. Beethoven's funeral had been an event of staggering scale, with a crowd numbering in the tens of thousands choking the streets of Vienna to follow the coffin of the man who had carried music to heights it had never known, the young Schubert among the torchbearers, himself destined to die the very next year and to be buried close by. But even so revered a body was not spared the hands of admirers and scientists. Locks of his hair, clipped from his head as he lay dying, scattered across 2 continents as treasured mementos, and when one such lock was subjected to chemical analysis generations later it was found to be saturated with lead, offering a haunting possible explanation for the mysterious ailments and the deafness that had shadowed his life. Then, decades after his burial, his body was dug up so that scholars might study and preserve it, and in the course of that examination, fragments of his very skull were quietly slipped into the pockets of those present, pieces that would wander for generations and scatter across the world, a portion of them coming to rest, astonishingly, in a research collection on the far side of America. When at last he was reburied among the other titans of music in Vienna's great cemetery, the honor was real and the mourning sincere, but the man they laid to rest was, in a quiet and troubling sense, no longer entirely all there. In recent years, scientists have returned to those scattered locks of hair with the tools of modern genetics, sequencing his very genome from strands snipped nearly 2 centuries ago, and coaxing new secrets about his health and his suffering from the same relics that grave-robbing sentiment first carried out of Vienna, so that the pieces of him taken as morbid keepsakes have, strangely, become instruments of understanding. He rests here now, reburied among the masters, though scattered pieces of him drifted far from the tomb. Let us travel now to the city of Naples, in Italy, to the Del Pianto Cemetery, to the grave of the immortal tenor Enrico Caruso, whose embalmed body was kept on display beneath glass for years, a spectacle for the curious. Caruso, was the most celebrated singer of his era, a voice of such power and beauty that he became the first true recording star, adored around the globe, and when he died in Naples in 1921, at only 48, his grieving city gave him a funeral fit for royalty. But rather than sealing him away, his family placed his beautifully embalmed body, so well preserved that he seemed merely asleep, into a glass sarcophagus and left it open to view. For 8 long years the great tenor lay under that glass, dressed in fine evening clothes, while mourners and tourists filed past to gaze upon his uncannily lifelike face, and by some accounts his body was even redressed in fresh, fashionable clothing from time to time, an attendant lifting the flag that covered him for anyone who cared to tip. Only in 1929 did his widow at last put an end to the macabre display and have him sealed away in a proper tomb. Caruso had risen from a poor Naples childhood, one of a great crowd of siblings, to become the most famous singer on earth, the first true recording star, whose voice pouring from the horns of early gramophones made him a household name in places that would never see him sing. When illness cut him down at the height of his powers, his death was mourned as a national tragedy, and the king himself decreed that a basilica normally reserved for royalty be opened for his funeral. But it was what followed that unsettles. Rather than sealing their beloved tenor away, his family placed his embalmed body, which the embalmer's art had rendered eerily lifelike, into a coffin fitted with glass, and left it open to the gaze of the world. For the better part of a decade, the great Caruso lay there under glass in his finest evening clothes, looking, visitors marveled, almost as though he might rise and sing, while a caretaker lifted the flag that draped him for anyone willing to press a coin into his hand. And, by some accounts, the body was taken out and redressed in the latest fashion every few years. A visiting traveler recorded his astonishment at finding the corpse so perfectly preserved and so casually displayed. Only when his widow could bear the spectacle no longer, near the end of the 1920s, was he finally sealed away in a proper tomb. The rooms in the Naples hotel where he died were kept exactly as he had left them and preserved as a kind of shrine, so that even as his displayed body drew the curious to the cemetery, the place of his death became its own quiet monument. The great voice memorialized at both ends of its final chapter, in the suite where it fell silent and the glass case where it lay on show. He rests here now, hidden from view at last, his long exhibition over. Let us travel now to Alsip, Illinois, near Chicago, to Burr Oak Cemetery, and to a story that begins in horror but ends, thankfully, in restored dignity, the story of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy whose murder in Mississippi in 1955 and whose mother's brave and heartbreaking decision to hold an open casket funeral so that the whole world would be forced to see what had been done to her child helped to ignite the American civil rights movement. He was laid to rest here at Burr Oak, and for half a century he lay in peace. But in 2009, a monstrous scandal erupted at the cemetery when it was discovered that workers had been digging up hundreds of graves and reselling the plots for profit, dumping the disinterred remains in a weed-choked back lot. Amid the investigation of that desecration came a discovery that stunned the nation. Emmett Till's original glass-topped casket, the very one from that historic funeral, which had been respectfully retired after his body was moved during a renewed inquiry into his case, was found abandoned and rusting in a decaying shed on the cemetery grounds, cast aside among the litter. But the story did not end in that shed. The casket was rescued, lovingly restored, and given to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History in Washington, where it is now enshrined as one of the most sacred objects of the movement, honored by all who pass. When his mother chose to leave his casket open at his funeral, insisting that the world be made to look upon what had been done, tens of thousands came to Chicago to file past, and the photographs that spread from that room stirred the conscience of a nation and helped set the civil rights movement in motion. For 50 years he lay in quiet dignity at Burr Oak. The scandal that broke there in 2009 was among the most sickening ever to touch an American cemetery, a scheme in which workers dug up hundreds of graves and sold the plots a second time, discarding the remains of the forgotten dead in a desolate stretch of ground, all for the sake of a few dollars. It was in the shadow of that investigation that Emmett's original casket was found, the very one from the funeral that had changed history, which had been carefully retired years earlier when his body was moved during a renewed inquiry into his death. Instead of being preserved with the reverence it deserved, it had been shoved into a crumbling shed and left to rust among the trash. A discovery that struck many as a second desecration piled upon the first. But this story, unlike so many we have told tonight, was given a redemptive ending. For the casket was rescued and painstakingly restored and carried to the Great National Museum in Washington, where it now stands as a sacred witness, visited with bowed heads by people from all over the world. He rests here now, undisturbed, his memory lifted from disgrace into a place of honor. Let us travel now to Los Angeles, to the small and star-studded Westwood Village Memorial Park, to the wall crypt of Marilyn Monroe, whose tomb became, in the strangest way, one of the most coveted addresses in the world. Monroe, the luminous and tragic screen goddess, died in 1962 at only 36, and was entombed in a simple crypt in this quiet cemetery, where Joe DiMaggio, who never stopped loving her, had roses delivered for 20 years. But the crypts surrounding her soon became objects of bizarre obsession. The man who purchased the crypt directly above hers arranged, according to his widow, to be entombed face down, so that he might spend eternity turned toward Marilyn below him. Years later, that same widow tried to sell the crypt above Monroe at auction on the internet to pay off her mortgage, and the bidding climbed past $4 million before the sale collapsed. And the founder of a famous magazine, which had put Monroe on its very first cover without her consent, bought the crypt on the other side of her for a small fortune, and was laid to rest beside her decades after her death. Monroe had been the most desired woman in the world and, by many accounts, one of the loneliest, and there is something almost unbearably fitting and almost unbearably sad in the way even her tomb became an object of other people's wanting. For 20 years, the man who had loved her most faithfully saw to it that fresh roses appeared at her crypt, a vigil of devotion that stood in stark contrast to the stranger obsessions gathering around her. The man who bought the crypt, directly above her own, arranged to be laid in it, face down, so that he might spend eternity turned toward her, and when his widow later needed money, she offered that very crypt, the one hovering just above Marilyn, for sale to the highest bidder online, the price climbing into the millions before the deal fell apart. On her other side, the publisher who had made his fortune, putting her image, taken without her permission, on the first cover of his magazine, bought the neighboring crypt for himself years in advance and was duly installed beside her after his own death, so that she lies for eternity between two men drawn to her by desire. Her small crypt marker has been worn smooth and discolored by the lips and hands of admirers who still come to touch it. Even here, even now, the world will not quite let her be. In life, she had often felt like a possession, passed between studios and husbands and powerful men who each wanted a piece of her, and she complained that the world loved the dazzling image it had built far more than the woman beneath it. That the very same hunger should follow her past death, turning the space around her coffin into coveted real estate, and her marker into a thing to be kissed and photographed, is perhaps the most disquieting epilogue of all. She rests here now, hemmed in by the longing of strangers, even in the grave. And so we come to the very last grave of our long journey, and it belongs, fittingly, to the greatest writer in the English language, a man who foresaw the disturbing fate that might await his own bones and tried, with a curse, to prevent it. Let us travel to Stratford-upon-Avon, to the Holy Trinity Church, where William Shakespeare lies buried within the church itself, beneath a plain stone that bears no name, only a warning. Shakespeare died in 1616, and he knew the custom of his time all too well, that old bones were routinely dug up and cleared away into charnel houses to make room for the newly dead. Determined that this should never happen to him, he had a grim little rhyme carved into his gravestone, blessing anyone who left his bones in peace and calling down a curse upon anyone who dared to move them. For 4 centuries the curse seemed to hold, and his grave was never opened. But in 2016, a team of researchers passed ground-penetrating radar over the grave for a documentary. And what they found sent a chill through the world of scholarship, for the scan revealed signs of disturbance at the head of the grave, and suggested that Shakespeare's skull may not be there at all, that it may have been quietly stolen long ago, curse or no curse, perhaps by trophy hunters more than 2 centuries past, exactly as an old and once dismissed tale had claimed. He lies within the church itself, rather than in the yard outside, a privilege of his standing in the town rather than a tribute to a fame that would only swell after his death, and his stone bears no name at all, Only the 4 blunt lines of his warning, blessing the man who leaves the stones untouched and cursing, in the plainest terms, whoever should move his bones. It was no idle worry. In his day, the floors and yards of churches were periodically cleared, the older bones shoveled out into grim communal charnel houses to make room for the freshly dead. And Shakespeare, it seems, was determined to escape that indignity, trusting his fate to a rhyme rather than to any monument. For 400 years it appeared to work, his grave left sealed and unopened while the curse passed into legend. Yet the quiet radar survey of our own century found the head of the grave disturbed and patched, hinting that his skull had been spirited away long ago, most likely by trophy hunters late in the 1700s, precisely as a strange old magazine tale had once insisted before scholars laughed it off. If it is true, then the one man who tried hardest of all the souls we have visited tonight to guard his own grave was, in the end, robbed of the very part of himself he most feared to lose. His warning read, and defied by thieves working in the dark. He rests here now beneath his warning stone, the greatest of all our poets, perhaps robbed at last of the very thing he begged the world to leave alone. And so, friends, our long and troubling walk draws to its close. Across 30 graves we have witnessed nearly every violation the living can inflict upon the dead. We have seen bodies stolen for ransom and burned in the desert, heads struck off and mounted on spikes, skulls carried away to be studied and sold and inscribed like keepsakes, bones fought over by cities and nations and scattered until no one could find them, corpses displayed beneath glass and hidden beneath concrete, and a poet's own curse, perhaps, defied. It would be easy to leave this place believing only the worst of us, that fame is a kind of sentence, that the price of being loved or hated or remembered is to be pursued even into the ground, and denied the simple peace that the humblest and most anonymous among us are freely given. And there is truth in that, a hard and genuine truth, that celebrity can rob a person of the one refuge every human being is promised. But I would ask you to carry away something else as well. That quiet thread of grace I asked you to watch for at the start. For alongside every theft and every desecration in these stories, we have seen the living fight to make things right. Families pouring concrete and forging steel to guard their loved ones, nations bringing their wandering dead home to honored tombs, a stolen skull recovered from a sale room and restored to its grave, a desecrated casket lifted from a rotting shed and enshrined at last in a place of national honor. The grave, it turns out, is where we reveal what we truly are, our greed and our cruelty and our morbid curiosity, yes, but also our reverence, our loyalty, and our stubborn, tender determination that the dead should not be forgotten or defiled. Both of those things are in us, and both have walked beside us tonight. So remember these 30 souls, the famous and the infamous, the ransomed and the scattered and the restored, and remember that how we treat the dead is only ever a mirror of how we regard the living. Perhaps that is the final and most useful thing these disturbed graves have to teach us. We build tombs and carve stones and lower our dead into the earth, not really for the dead at all, who are long past all reach of comfort or insult, but for ourselves, the living, as a promise we make to one another that we will not simply be forgotten, that we will be handled with tenderness when we can no longer speak for ourselves. When a grave is violated, it is that promise that is broken, and when a grave is guarded or recovered or restored, it is that promise being kept. Every slab of concrete, and every skull carried home, and every casket lifted out of the dirt and set in a place of honor is, in the end, a message from the living to the living about the kind of people we mean to be. Rest well, friends. All 30 of you, disturbed and stolen and argued over, and, we can only hope, at peace at last. And rest well to you too, my fellow travelers, who walked this whole dark road beside me and did not turn away. Hold the memory of the departed gently. Guard the peace of those you have laid to rest, and until we walk together again, good night.